from the Gospel of Luke. Meanwhile, the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around Jesus to listen to his teaching, at which the Pharisees and the religious scholars murmured, "This person welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus then addressed this parable to them. A man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to their father, "Give me the share of the estate that is coming to me." So the father divided up the property between them. Some days later, the younger son gathered up his belongings and went off to a distant land. Here he squandered all his money on loose living. After everything was spent, a great famine broke out in the land, and the son was in great need. So he went to the landowner, who sent him to a farm to take care of the pigs. The son was so hungry that he could have eaten the husks that were fodder for the pigs, but no one made a move to give him anything. Coming to his senses at last, he said, "How many hired hands at my father's house have more than enough to eat, while here I am starving? I'll quit and go back home and say, 'I've sinned against God and against you. I no longer deserve to be called one of your children. Treat me like one of your hired hands.'" And with that, the younger son set off for home. While still a long way off, the father caught sight of the returning child and was deeply moved. The father ran out to meet him, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "I've sinned against God and against you. I no longer deserve to be called one of your children." But his father said to one of the workers, "Quick, bring out the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. Take the calf we've been fattening and butcher it. Let's eat and celebrate. This son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and now he's found." And the celebration began. Meanwhile, the elder son had been out in the field. As he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the workers and asked what was happening. The worker answered, "Your brother is home, and the fatted calf has been killed because your father has him back safe and sound." The son got angry at this and refused to go to the party, but his father came out and pleaded with him. The older son replied, "Look, for years now I've done every single thing you've asked me to do. I never disobeyed even one of your orders. Yet you never gave me so much as a kid goat to celebrate with my friends. But then this son of yours comes home after going through your money with prostitutes, and you kill the fatted calf for him." "But my child," the father said, "you're with me always, and everything I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and rejoice. This brother of yours was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, and now he's found." May God add a blessing to the hearing of this word. Let's pray. Gracious God, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So how many of y'all have heard some variation of this gospel reading that we just heard today? This story, more famously known as the prodigal son, is one of, if not the most popular parables spoken by Jesus. And this week, I had a prodigal son experience as I tried to prepare for this sermon. So knowing how popular this text is, I was trying to decide to lace up my shoes and run off to somewhere else, exploring the Corinthian text. Because what can I possibly offer to take away from this parable when so much has already been offered in many different forms? I was feeling maybe a little insignificant as this younger brother in this story, so I left. Spent some time away, trying to feel my way through this letter that we heard from Paul, which is also full of possibility in its own way. But it was so very distracting, trying to find a focus on something else, when this parable just would not leave my mind alone. Even though I kept telling myself not to even bother, I found there really was nothing left for me to do but to come back to it. It's amazing though, because when I made that realization, when I stopped running away from this text, the text took me back in the way the Father ran and hugged his wayward son. It became abundantly clear how and why this text made its way to me here at First Congo on this Sunday at this time in our lives as a faith community. The parable starts off with the younger of two sons demanding his inheritance from his father. Not only did he not ask, but in his demand, he's pretty much just declared that his father is dead to him, taking what was supposed to be his only after his father's actual death. But even so, the father agrees and does what he needs to do, probably selling off property and livestock to give this son his share of the inheritance. And so a few days later, we're told that the son took everything and he traveled away to a distant land. And it's there that he spent his money living wildly, doing who even knows what. When he realizes he has nothing left, he desperately finds a job tending pigs for one of these landowners of this country he's in. And even though he'd gotten this job, he realizes that no one even cared to give him anything to eat. As he's feeding these pigs, these animals that he's learned his whole life are unclean, he not only realizes how he's gotten in, or he not only realizes, how he's having to now deal with these unclean animals, but also his desire out of desperation to eat the scraps of fodder given to these unclean pigs. And he realizes that back home, even the hired hands were treated better than this. Even they have more than enough to eat, while here he is starving. And so that's when he decides to go back home. And he prepares this speech to grovel back to his father. He's even prepared just to be treated as one of the hired hands, rather than his beloved son. That was still better than his current situation. So he heads back, prepared to live life as his hired hand, but as he rounds the corner back to his former home, he isn't prepared for what happens next. His father saw him from afar and ran. Men of his age and stature did not run back then. They just didn't. True story. I don't even run my errands while we're talking about it. But imagine this man of stature and status running toward this wayward son who should have been disowned. And when he gets to him, he hugs him and he kisses him. But he doesn't even stop there. Barely has the son started to give him his repentance speech when his father calls for the workers to bring him the finest robes and to put it on his son. He tells him to put a ring on it, not like Beyonce, right? But to exemplify that this is indeed a son of his father. And they put shoes on his feet. The father tells them to get the fattest calf and to butcher it so they can feast lavishly and celebrate that this son is alive and well. He was lost and now he is found. And the celebration begins. And while all this is happening, the older son was out in the field doing work as he always does. And he heads back to the house and he hears the kerfuffle, the music and the celebration and the dancing. So he calls over this worker to ask, what's going on? And the worker tells him his younger brother is home again. And this calf that they've been working to fatten up is on the menu for this extravagant celebration. Unlike his father, this brother is angry and decides not to go to the party. So his father comes out to him and he starts pleading with him to reconsider. But the older son replies, "Look, for years now, I've done every single thing you have asked of me. I have never disobeyed anything that you ever told me to do. And you have never given me even just a baby goat to celebrate with my friends. But then this son of yours comes home after gallivanting with prostitutes, and you killed the fatted calf for him?" I'm sure there are many times where most, maybe all of us, have related to this response of the older brother. How was this fair at all? Being a chronic rule follower myself, I can actually have some sympathy for this older brother. But the father tries to reason with him. He tells him, "But my child, you're with me always, and everything I have is yours already. But we have to celebrate and rejoice. This brother of yours was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and now he is found." And that's where the parable ends. We never get to hear how things play out that night or in the years to come. We don't get to hear if the older brother receives his father's explanation or if the brothers ever get to reconcile their own differences. It's left open-ended. And I suspect that some elements of this parable that were meant to leave those hearing it back then in wonder are getting lost in cultural translation. Because we don't live in the time and the place of those gathered to hear Jesus tell that story. I know that there are themes in here that we're missing. The scandal of God's realm here on this earth in a way that's countercultural. That's why Jesus used parables, after all, to draw people in by telling short, memorable stories, using common language and imagery, and then flipping the story on its head, using not-so-common twists that would shock and tease the mind into imagining new ways of being in the world. Parables allowed Jesus to use everyday happenings to bring light to the mysteries of God's realm. And this parable is no different. We so often, hear this parable and imagine God as the father in the story and align ourselves with one son or the other depending on what's going on in our lives. That's the sermon I was resisting preaching today. The one that's often coupled with a problematic theology of backsliding and berating the very nature of humanity. And so I ran away. But I couldn't not make my way back to this parable. And as the metaphorical father ran toward me and embraced me and kissed me and prepared a feast in celebration of my return to this text, it became clear to me what was missing. I find it no accident that this text came up during this time of ongoing transition in the life of this faith community. It's no accident that this text is here as we journey through this sacred time of Lent, as we search ourselves and prepare for the death and resurrection of Christ. And so as I stood there in the Father's embrace, watching the workers bustle around and make preparations for the celebration of my return to this text, let me share with you the question that came to my mind. A question that allows us to do a bit of our own parable making that would be relevant to our modern ears so that we might be able to allow this text to shock and tease our minds into imagining new ways of being in this world. What if God is the prodigal son? Think about that for a second. If God is the prodigal son, how does that reshape our hearing of this story? It suddenly makes sense in a very different way, because if you look back at the first 3 verses of this text, Jesus was addressing the social elite of the time. These were people like the elder brother who's having a hard time accepting the seemingly sinful and other than younger brother. Throughout his ministry, Jesus spent so much time with the outsider, the outcast, and the scandalous people of society. And so I ask again, what if God is the prodigal son? God comes to us as the oppressed, and those who are socially unlike us, and those who believe differently than we believe, and those who make horrible decisions in their lives, and those who abuse and those who are abused, and those who sin differently than we sin. God comes to us as the prodigal son who challenges us to rethink our response to the other, and requires for us to be extravagant in our welcome, to be radical in our hospitality, and downright countercultural in our navigation of societal rules. I first want to highlight what an amazing thing it is for us to be in this time of transition. It's also been a blessing to be able to be steady in being a place of welcome for the many who have come through these doors over the years. we'll take a minute and recognize that, yes, God is still moving and speaking in this place. But I also want to leave us with a challenge. As we take this time during Lent and in the next several months ahead of us, listening all over again about how God might be speaking to us in this time and place. Are we doing so as the father in the story or as the older brother? As God comes to us in the many forms and iterations of the prodigal son, are we going to cling so tightly to even the flexible rules that we've set for ourselves over the years and the vast traditions that have shaped who we are today in a way that perhaps unintentionally leaves no room for God's abundant love and grace for those coming into our community? Or will we, like the Father, embrace those who find their way here in search of a good and meaningful life in community and in Christ? And not just when they get here, but will we have the desire to keep watch for them and the eyes to see them from afar and the courage to go against the grains of society and run toward them and give them the very best of what we've got, deservedness aside, no questions asked? It's pretty clear which answer I'm hoping we'll choose as a faith community. And unlike the parable that kind of left us hanging, we get to shape how the story goes from here. So what'll it be, First Congo? How will our story unfold? Amen.